There we go.
Awesome. Okay, so we are here to talk about teaching with comics and using comics in libraries, classrooms, and other settings with schools and educators, and of course students. I'm Shannon Live. I am the director and of outreach and the president of Bat City Comic Professionals, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that teaches reading, writing, and imagination skills through comics. We are also an Eisner finalist comic book store located in Bradenton, Florida. And so we use our space as a way to help teach kids and educators how they can use comics to learn. And with me today is Dr. Zachary Stuckelman. Hello, Zach.
Hi, Shannon. Yeah, I'm so excited to join you here today.
Awesome. Tell us all about yourself, Zach. What is it that you do?
I am an educator. I received my doctorate in developmental psychology from Vanderbilt University, where I still teach today for a program there called the Program for Talented Youth, which services children who are performing at a higher academic level and thus are looking for more advanced educational opportunities to kind of supplement their typical coursework. And so through that platform, I actually teach classes about comic books within the classroom, as well as utilizing comic book literature to help teach different psychological concepts with students from the ages of third grade all the way to seniors in high school. So it's a big kind of source of education for me and one that I'm very passionate about incorporating into my curriculum.
Nice. And one of the things that I have loved hearing from many of the panels this week for Will Eisner Week is how people got into comics in the first place. So for me, I grew up on Riverdale Street in San Antonio, Texas. So I was convinced that I lived in the same exact place as Archie and Betty and Veronica, and of course Jughead. And it was a very different neighborhood than the one they lived in. So I was always really confused as to why our neighborhoods look so different. But it was the kind of the stepping stone for me. I had a mom who we never went to a comic book shop, but I could pick out an Archie because that's what she read at the grocery store. And so it's thankfully they had them at the grocery store back then. And I was able to grab one as often as I could. And then things I could get at bookstores were always in graphic novel form. And so it was really great. But I didn't come into that weekly comic reading until after college, really. There wasn't a comic book store in the town that I went to school. So it wasn't until I moved to Austin in 2005 that I actually got to go to a comic book store on my own and start picking out my comics and getting really excited about them. And, then I became a professional cosplayer. So it's surrounded by comics at all time. And it wasn't until I was working in a school that I had seen a lot of people. I was working as a reading and writing specialist, and I was from a private education company, and been brought in to a school where they had failed the standardized test so many times that they were now taking it in both the fall and the spring. And so the kids would study for the practice test in the fall and then take the practice test, and the system would analyze their results, and then they would figure out what's focused on in the spring. So all they did all year long was focus on standardized tests. They didn't learn anything else in their reading and writing classes. And I talked to the administration and said, from what my conversations with these girls are, because it was an all-girls school, is that they're upset about the fact that all they do is the same worksheets over and over again. So they're not even trying to put in the effort. And by the time they get to the standardized test, they're so over it, they're not even trying. I had a girl who literally said she didn't even write her name on her test until it was due. She never answered a single question because the pencil is too far and she didn't want to put the effort in at that point. And I went to them and said, hey, but what they are looking at is they're reading magazines in class. They're picking up their young adult novels. They're reading stuff on their phone. What if we made a pop culture classroom for them? And we make a writing lab and a reading lab out of that. And so I built curriculums that matched all the standards for the test, but used comic books and used YA novels and used movies and TV shows. And that was kind of the start for me of really diving into not just reading comics, but using comics for educational purposes. And then I spurred that into developing it for a Boys and Girls Club lesson that I was doing. And then eventually it just kind of spiraled into an entire nonprofit organization. And now I read about 70 comic books a week and promote indie comics through that, and promote children's comics and children's graphic novels. And I could not imagine not talking about comic books 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Zach, how did you get here?
Yeah. I mean, I was a big reader as a kid. I think it was something that, my parents in particular were very passionate about developing out my literacy skills from a very young age. And I think one of the things that really drew me into literacy was comic books. I think, one of the things that really is unlike any other medium for the most part is you're getting these very complex grammatical structures, you're getting really important vocabulary words, but you're also lining them up with images that frankly allow kids to hopefully process and understand those sorts of things in a little bit more of a scaffolded and easier way, excuse me. And so I think for me, I grew up just loving anything fantasy. And so by the time I was, I don't even know, maybe 3 or 4 years old, I knew who Batman was. I knew who Spider-Man was. I knew who Captain America was. And by the time I was 6, my mom had gotten me. I actually, came of age in terms of a reader right around the time that Marvel launched their Ultimate Universe line. And so I consumed all of Brian Michael Bendis's uh, in Ultimate Spider-Man. It was just all of the graphic novels. Every time I would go to like a Borders bookstore or a Barnes and Noble or wherever, those sorts of things were sold, I would buy it. And I also was very lucky enough to grow up in a generation of people who had a ton of pop culture kind of strengthening and growing around comic book, as the source material. So, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films, The Dark Knight, into, the CW universe, all of those things that were really, I think, prominent parts of just like general teenager, young adult conversations was a big part of my growing up. But I definitely took a lull in reading comic books and utilizing comic books just as like a form of entertainment for myself, probably kind of like you, Shannon, until after college when I, had been a massive, follower of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of all of this comic pop culture, and decided, one day to go to a comic book store just to pass the time. And I picked up a single issue and just literally just kind of went through the entire shelf of books that week and just picked out everything that I could that I really just wanted to consume. And then around that similar time, I was also starting to teach more and get involved in more of educational settings. And I actually was teaching a class for college students that I made focus in on superhero psychology. So using comic book literature, making my students read comic books, whether single issues or collections, in order to kind of do a deep dive into different characters' identities, to think about archetypes within the literature format that is comic books, thinking about different, even just mental illnesses within the context of certain supervillains. And what I found was that, unlike some of my traditional psychology classes, I was getting a lot more out of even the quietest of students, because they found that they were, had common ground with whether it was a, sorority girl or a president of, a student organization, to the kids who just kind of kept to themselves and kept themselves in the library. Everybody kind of could find some common ground in characters that they resonated with or felt that they had seen in a show or what have you. And so from there, I was really just inspired to try and utilize this format within education settings as much as possible, whether it is, discussing with a third grader some kids' comics that you yourself had recommended to me, like teenagers looking at Kami Garcia's Raven and Teen Titans and Beast Boy graphic novels, to college students having them, deep dive into the existential kind of dread that is Alan Moore's Watchmen, utilizing these not only within my own life to kind of just have a really great way to think about psychological concepts and various, obviously educational conundrums, but also just I love comic books. I mean, I've got long boxes back here. I've got all of my graphic novels on my bookshelf. It's something that I think it was really much like you, thinking about how can I not talk about comics 24 hours a day. To me, it's like, how can I not, bring my passion for this art form together with my career choices of, looking into education in various forms of media and helping, students and learners all around the world to benefit their literacy, but also just their overarching, education development.
Absolutely. I always feel like once somebody has a conversation like that, I always feel it necessary to remind people who may be watching who aren't using comics in their classroom that comics are a medium, not a genre. And so, we both talked a little bit about the superheroes and things like that that we resonated with, but you mentioned other characters and other stories. And I think it's so important to remind people that comics as a medium are literature and art in every single genre. There is horror, there is sci-fi, there's romance, there's historical fiction, there's historical nonfiction. There is
Absolutely.
a lot of nonfiction for those who are thinking, how can I use this in my classroom if I'm not teaching something like a literary analysis or a writing analysis? There is such a great opportunity with books that are nonfiction. I actually have one that came out this week, which is actually called Whistleblowers. And it is the story of four different people who fought to bring the information regarding the Holocaust to America. And it's talking about people who brought that information over and that we don't normally talk about. This doesn't just highlight all of the same people over and over again. And it does give not only those true stories, but it gives you, like you said, that visual element to mix in with it. And so you're able to talk about the iconography and the actual scenarios that happen and see it in a way that kids might not have ever seen something like that at this point. We're learning it out of a history book and you're seeing the same image over and over again in every grade, but when they illustrate these stories you're actually able to see more of that and kind of recognize more of those, even those warning signs of things that are happening, and able to talk about it more. And so I think, constantly focusing on, for so many people who are coming to comics that are new, saying, oh, well, I'm not going to teach superheroes in my classroom. Of course, as a civics lesson, you should be, or a psychology lesson, you should teach superheroes in your classroom. But there are a lot of, nonfiction stories, Representative John Lewis's March being a big one.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another thing that is often forgotten is also there are many graphic novel adaptations of many of the classic, oftentimes part of state or traditional like school board curriculum novels, things like The Giver, The Odyssey. I'm trying to think of other ones that you and I have talked about. I mean, even Percy Jackson, right? Like books that many kids utilized growing up to help them learn to read. You have graphic novel adaptations of Romeo and Juliet is another one. Macbeth, like, I mean, I found so many different graphic novel adaptations of like important texts that, many, many, many English language arts teachers have utilized for decades to help, assess the ability to understand themes and symbols, metaphors, to look at different styles of prose. Some of these graphic novels even are just verbatim what the original novelist or writer gave in their text, but it just has pictures associated with it. And it may seem for some educators like, well, how are we going to help kids learn, these important topics if we are having them focus on pictures? But you have to also think about those students who may not always click with just words, who may not always just be able to take a sentence and really visualize a scene or visualize a consistent thematic line throughout an entire novel. And I mean, this is something that even myself, who has a PhD, struggled with in my early days of schooling. So I think in a lot of ways, it's easy to kind of pigeonhole comic book literature into that bang, pow, flam sort of stylization, when in reality, the medium itself has expanded so far beyond that, and frankly has been doing so for longer than I think most people realize.
Absolutely. I mean, we are talking about, Will Eisner week, and this is a man who in the 40s was doing that already, was giving us those stories, was giving us that symbology, was giving us, regular humans making decisions and giving us slice of life stories. That's something that in the earliest days of the golden age comics, we already had that happening. And, comics in America come from the comic strip, which started in 1894 when comic strips really started to take off in American newspapers. And they weren't superheroes. They were, it wasn't until 1938 when Superman lifted a car above his head that we had superheroes really as our focal point.
No,
And
you
there was
absolutely.
there was so much that we had already done, and a lot of it was just focusing on that day-to-day life. I do want to say, you're talking about literary adaptations, and if we're talking about kids in this age bracket right now, the other important thing to keep in mind is that there is a manga adaptation of every classic literature book as well. And kids these days, they are loving anime. We are at the second largest anime manga revolution in America that we've seen throughout history. And it is actually, I believe, at this point surpassing the one from the late 80s, early 90s. I think we've actually surpassed it at this point. And I you can get anybody from the age of 13 to the age of 25 into reading, probably by handing them a manga that is an adaptation of that their favorite anime was adapted from, or giving them something that feels like that. And so if you are seeing a high school student who's not interested in reading those classics that are on your curriculum that you have to give them, hand them that manga version of it, and watch them come and pour into it. I was like you, I was a voracious reader. When I was in the third grade, fourth grade, I went to Barnes and Noble and I bought a copy of Romeo and Juliet, the actual, like the play, the classic text. I was so excited because I had just heard all about it, and they told me I was reading on a college level and I should pick something harder. So I went to the store and I got that. It was my choice. And I carried that. It was one of those digest size versions of it. And it was the full play, carried around with me everywhere. I memorized it. Now, let's be honest. By the fifth grade, I still didn't know what 90% of that probably meant. But a movie came out starring a certain man named Leonardo DiCaprio. And they kept the text exactly the same as it is in the play, but brought everything into modern culture. And there are jokes that Shakespeare wrote into the play that are lost on most people at this point in time because we didn't understand the humor of the time. We didn't know, like, the sarcasm or the slang. And I saw Leonardo DiCaprio deliver some of these lines, and I was like, "Oh my god, is that what that means?" And I was like, "I've been saying that for so long." I had no idea that that was like a sexual phrase or a dirty phrase, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know." And now I understand what it means, and because I have a visual element to put with it, and I'm able to see that. And I knew the play by memory. And I had a college reading level, and I still didn't necessarily know all of those things until I saw that. And that was for me where I was like, had that first realization that sometimes you do need to see a visual element that really explains what it is that you're reading to fully grasp, especially something in those classics that are so different, and so the wording and everything means something more, or gets buried in the text, honestly, because some of them, they're just not as entertaining that to the generations that we're in now. And so giving them something that makes it something that they are requesting and something they're hungering for, is just such a powerful tool just to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways, this goes even farther into like from a psychological and a learning sciences perspective. What you were speaking to and what I was speaking to is this idea of dual coding theory, right? This idea that in fact many kids learn even better when there is that visual component paired with some text. It's not necessarily to say that it always has to be a graphic novel or a comic book, but to your point, right, it's like sometimes the click doesn't happen without that accompanying supplemental form of presentation style. If you leave it to just text, it's possible that misinterpretation can happen, but it's also possible that comprehension may not be at its fullest without that accompanying style of visual or audio or actual video. That theory, which is grounded in learning sciences, demonstrates the power of something like a graphic novel. It demonstrates that when you pair these two things together, they sometimes are better than the sum of their individual parts. It's not to say that a pretty picture doesn't paint 1,000 words, and it's not to say that the best novel in the world still isn't the best without its pictures. It's just to say that, especially for younger learners and kids who are still trying to get into literacy activities and various forms of reading comprehension skills, that this may be a path towards a better education style.
Yeah, and I want to share this image really fast with everyone because I've got, let's see here, got it up. And this is just an image on dual coding theory and that whole concept that, we have words and verbal processing and we build that knowledge, but we have images and nonverbal processing also leading to knowledge, but that connection just really develops it a little bit further. Last September, I actually gave a TED talk on this exact subject and how comics and education are so valuable because of the dual coding theory, and how when you take that, you don't just have that immediate memory, but you do build that long-term memory. Dr. Alan Piavio, who created the dual coding theory, he said that one of the biggest things was that our brains are wired to think in terms of verbal and visual elements at the same time. And so not only does it help with the immediate learning, but it does improve that retention, and it drives knowledge even further. And so we've got that right here in the palm of our hands of the comic book. We've got words and pictures, and he actually took that philosophy even further and said that when the verbal information and the words were presented in sequential format, that it actually strengthens it even further. And comics are sequential literature, and so you're getting everything that his theory hypothesized on right in the middle of a comic book. And it's such a great moment to be able to say, like, hey, we've got this, and we can use it. We've got this tool in front of us, and you've got new ones every month, every week. If you want to push that as far as you can, there's new knowledge, there's new resources coming out every single week of the month with comic books. I know we're talking about the reading side, and we even mentioned the historical side. For us at Bat City, we use it a lot. Our biggest program is actually using it for writing. And we have a program where we teach kids the basic elements of writing, the basic hero's journey, where we develop a character, we develop problems and our solution through comic book creation, because we know that kids love that medium. And so we have these moments where, we do workshops every week in store, but we also go to schools and libraries. We're partnered with the Boys and Girls Club, the school system, and 4 counties worth of libraries at this point, that we go around and we work with them on this program. And it's so great to see kids get to take something in their mind and figure out how to put it together. Kids who come in and their parents say, oh, well, they're not very vocal, their teacher says they don't participate a lot in class, and they're the one raising their hand constantly to be a part of the collaboration process when we make one big story on the board. And then you turn to them and you look at the book that they've created, and their story is so detailed. They're able to put so much of their imagination into it, or themselves. I talked about this in my TED talk, but I actually had a young girl who used that comic creation workshop as a way to explore her feelings towards feeling left out and lost and excluded during the retransition into going back to school after COVID. And she put that all into her comic story that she presented to a group of people that were her friends. And her whole story was about how she didn't feel like she had friends, and she didn't feel like she knew how to make them anymore after COVID. And then she turned around and just excitedly was sharing her comic with everybody. And then it wasn't until after she finished that she was like, oh my gosh, like, Miss Shannon, I just told everybody that I don't know how to make friends and I don't have any friends. Like, that's a lot. I need a minute. And because she shared that and her friends saw the drawings of her feeling sad, and she literally drew scenes where she was with those people and other friends, and she felt like she was on her own. And so they saw that and they were able to relate to that. And then they were all able to sit there and have a conversation about how everybody felt after that situation and how much they valued her friendship, but also the moments that they felt left out. And you had this group of 8 to 10-year-old girls suddenly having conversations that I wish I could get adults to have about their feelings. And it was just something that a comic book gave them the power to do. And I love the fact that this medium gives people a place where, I ran out of words. I don't know what to say anymore, but I know how to draw this picture. And I see that with so many kids who come in and say, I don't know how to draw, but they start writing their story and then they see other people drawing. So they start trying it and they push themselves to try art in the first time ever or in a new way. And it's so cool to see kids who take that chance. But then we also see it in the other way where we have a lot of kids who, when they first start coming to the workshop, they only draw their story. They don't put speech bubbles in, they don't put anything in it at all. They're just drawing. And then by the second or third time they come, they're starting to stick a little bit more wording in there, and they're starting to develop more because they've done that background work and they know how, and now they're starting to explore, how do I turn that into something that I put words with. And so you see that cognitive behavior start to grow. And my absolute favorite moment is when they say, oh my gosh, I think my teacher told me this. And I'm like, please go to your teacher and tell them you get it. Because your teacher needs to know that you had that aha moment where it clicked together, and let them know that this comic book got you there and you're at that moment now. But I don't know, have you used it to teach? I know you've helped me with a writing workshop before, but have you used it with any of your students on their writing and helping them bring that forward?
Um, yeah, I mean, I haven't used it specifically for like from a writing perspective, in terms of like that skill. I've used it more for like, I think the creation of superhero characters in particular is an activity that, I mean, many of us have done at some point in our lifetimes, maybe even as recently as adulthood. But like particularly with younger kids, I find that giving them the opportunity to create a fully fleshed out character with powers and a secret identity and like an archetype and all of these things allows them to also sometimes hold up a mirror to themselves and be like, why did I create this character and what does that say about me? It's given a lot of younger students the opportunity to think about like, this idea of like, what does, if you want to be super strong, what could that mean deep down about what your like desires are out of your life? And I think in many ways, kind of similar to this like writing of a story, creation of a character, I think inherently we always, even whether we know it or not, especially for you writers out there, we put ourselves into the stories or the characters that we create. And so when I give, especially again, younger students the opportunity to do that, they have this aha moment where they're like, oh, why did I say I wanted my character to be invisible? Like, what could that mean? And like, we dive deep into that topic of like, even I think, having run those writing workshops with you, Shannon, like that's sometimes the first step of your process is creating who are your characters, who are your villains, who are all of that stuff. And I think I've really tried to, in my education settings since then, in particular, dive into that first part because I think from a psychological standpoint, it presents a really interesting question for these kids and for learners of like, when I'm thinking about creating this basic building block of a story, I gave this character this conflict, or I gave this individual this superpower, or I gave them this opponent in the fight. Why? Right? And not why because it's cool or why because I really wanted a character that could throw fireballs. It's like, what does that say about who you are and what you want and what that means in your life? And I think, one of the things that I know you and I have talked about, a little bit going back to this idea of, literacy skills, but writing is amongst that, is this idea of dialogic reading and the idea of utilizing distancing, which is a skill from dialogic reading, or dialogic questioning, however you want to call it, to really engage students in the comic book narrative, but also when they're writing their own story in meaningful conversation. So dialogic reading or dialogic questioning, depending on how you want to use it, is all about creating a context in which story creation or just basic reading interactions are shared and promote really great joint conversation. It's about, taking a teacher, a caregiver, and having them become an active participant in the child's reading endeavors. And it doesn't even have to be during the reading session. You can just, after they finish an issue, a chapter, ask them what happened, and based on their questions, prompt them with more questions. I used this term distancing previously, like 5 seconds ago. What that basically means is taking the text or taking the story that they created or that they're reading and asking them, well, how does that relate to your life, right? How do you, when, let's say, Spider-Man, stops that robber, have you ever talked about or, tried to stop someone who was doing something wrong? How did that make you feel? What did you think about that when Spider-Man did that? And how does that connect to your life? That has been shown in research to actually increase the likelihood that children are more engaged in reading, that children take more away from activities that are literacy based. And so I really try and take that into my practices by when I'm doing this sort of character creation, villain creation, hero creation, etc., try and be like, okay, like you created a superhero whose powers is, let's say, to change any thing into a different element, like Element Lad from the Legion of Superheroes. um I just almost fell back in my chair. um why did you choose that? What does that say? What made you think about that? Yeah, I get it, it's cool, but like, let's talk a little bit more about what is it about that power that you think explains maybe an internal desire of the character, and thus by proxy what you want out of the world. And you can see them light up when they finally think of why, and the deeper why, and they just then dive right back in with a new kind of re-energization, vigor, whatever you want to call it, that it just makes it feel like they're just like, oh, I can do this and I can do that and I can build out this and I can make this that. And it just basically tunes it up to 150 rather than the typical maybe 70 or 80.
Yeah, we have I that's part of our process is, every kid gets to share each step along the way, and we talk about it, and we grow their story with them as they're building it out. And I actually had a kid who was in here the other day, and it wasn't during a workshop, but we keep some of the pages out just so that people can, color or create their own characters and things like that while they're sitting in the kids section. And I had a kid in here that he made his own character and drew some stuff while he was here. And I sat there and I asked him about it before he left. And I said, oh my gosh, well, what'd you draw? Oh, that's so cool. Why'd you want to do that? The same kind of dialogic questions. And I got a message from his mom later that said, for her son, the biggest thing is he always wants to know that adults value what he says. That he, as a 9 year old boy, he's really looking for that moment where an adult actually seems to care about what he's saying. And it just taking those extra 3 minutes of my day to ask this kid about his situation and what he was building changed everything for him. She said he went home and that's all he could talk about was, oh my gosh, and then I got to tell Miss Shannon this. And it wasn't about just the character anymore and about what he did, but it was about having that conversation. And we talk about those foundational memories that people build, the developmental memories that you build, and how much it can create a lover of reading in a young person by having those conversations. Like you said, like maybe you don't have time to sit there the whole day and read with them, or maybe you want them to learn how to do independent reading wherever they are in their process, but having that conversation afterwards makes it become something that's valuable and developmental for them, because they take that in and they're like, somebody cared about my opinion. Somebody wanted to hear why I liked it and what I thought about it. And it starts them on that path to that critical analysis that they're going to be doing for the rest of their life.
Yeah. And I kind of, you're touching on points that I want to also kind of look at the other side of that coin, which is something that even I experienced growing up and even as an adult, which is I think oftentimes sometimes with this type of literature, this medium, as you said before, Shannon, there does seem to be sometimes a public perception, both by parents, caregivers, and teachers, that comic books or graphic novels are not necessarily a valid form of literature, or they are not as significant or helpful or educational or beneficial as your traditional prose text, your traditional nonfiction textbooks, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that can be actually, especially for little ones, a really harmful mentality to take, because if you have a kiddo who is not necessarily clicking with your traditional, novel-based formats in their ELA classes, but then you're also making them feel like either within or outside of the classroom that what they are engaging in, the format that they do seem to click with, is not as important, not as helpful, not as mature even as your traditional prose novel. What you may actually inherently be doing is setting them up for avoiding all kinds of literacy activities in the future, rather than actually validating that really, look, there are certain types of reading that maybe are not appropriate for younger kids. There may be types that older adults may not want to do themselves, but to essentially kind of do that sort of comparative mentality and try and instill that in kids from a young age, you may actually be harming them more than setting them up for future success. Because let me tell you, it's a lot easier of a bridge to go from a like pretty like text heavy graphic novel to a full on prose novel to nothing to a prose novel. There is a huge difference there. And I think sometimes we forget that nuance, that there's a reason why, for instance, picture books, which in many ways can be seen in some ways as graphic novels or comic books, are such a popular format for younger kids, because they provide that really great transition into your introductory chapter books, into your later on larger prose novel like A Great Gatsby, a Where the Red Fern Grows, a Giver. But we often forget that graphic novels and comic books oftentimes have language, have text, have thematic things in them that are for older kids, that are essentially skipped over if we do not put them on the path to recognize that this form of literature or this medium is just as valid as any other form and is just as helpful. If we really spurn them for engaging in something that may click with them, we could essentially be setting them up for an avoidant life, a completely devoid life of literacy practices.
Absolutely. And talking about that, that's one of the things when I do educator seminars or parent seminars, I will take a picture book and a little golden book and a novel, a chapter book or an early reader book, and then a young adult novel, and kind of just go, and then a classic, and then immediately underneath it I will put that same picture book and the graphic novel, like Dog Man, a graphic novel like Dog Man, and then a manga, and then an adaptation of, like you said earlier, The Great Gatsby or something like that. And I'm like, spot the difference. There's not one. You're still running in those same levels. You're moving along the same path. We're saying, and to your point, like, so many people say, oh, well, it's not the same as a classic textbook or a classic adult novel, but it is. It still has, like you said, the visual elements, the thematic elements, the verbal elements in it. And we have our program, The Stories Belong First, and one of the things we do in that is each month kids come together, we sit in our classroom, and we all get the same comic, and everybody gets to play a character out of it, unless we have too many people, and then everybody just takes turns reading a page, and we read aloud because we want to build that confidence in reading aloud, so everybody who wants to gets to. We never force a kid who doesn't want to read aloud to read out loud, because we don't want to put that pressure on them, because anxiety and stress towards reading makes kids not want to like reading. And so we give everybody who wants to take a turn a chance to either play a character or read a page. And they want to, because we're reading a kid's comic book. And so they're like, oh man, I get to play Miles Morales this week. this is going to be so cool. Or I get to, we recently read Maleficent, and the first issue of the new Maleficent series from the Disney Villains line. And kids were like, oh my gosh, I get to read from Maleficent. Like, I've never seen a story from Maleficent's point of view. And in that same vein, we read that book, and we had a mixture of kids from 5 all the way to 13 in this group. And we had to pick something that was something everybody could kind of focus on and be excited about. And that was the first book that came out from the Disney Villains line. And we had the conversation of what is like an antagonist versus what is a villain. And how do you have those conversations? Like, is Maleficent, is the villain in Sleeping Beauty, but is she actually the villain in a story where it's from her point of view and she's telling us the story, and it's not the same story, it's not the Sleeping Beauty story. And so these kids got to see Maleficent from a different angle, but they're like, I know she's a villain, but she's not the bad guy. And I'm like, so she's not the antagonist? And they're like, no, she's the protagonist because she's the good guy in the story. A kid is trying to rob Maleficent in the story of all of her power. And so they're like, this kid is the villain, and why is he trying to steal from Maleficent? And one of the greatest things that happened in that class is we're sitting there and we see this moment where the kid gets caught. And Maleficent is telling the kid, you were trying to steal from me. You're trying to take my magic. You're very greedy. You're very selfish. And now you're lying, because the kid's like, oh, I was never doing any of those things. And the kid, is like, oh my gosh, don't punish me, Maleficent. I know you're the evil sorceress in the woods. Like, please, like, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I stopped everybody right there. And I said, prediction wise, or thinking in terms of what we're feeling, and we're taking all of our context clues, how many people think that this kid is genuinely remorseful versus sorry that he got caught? And the 5-year-old sitting there coloring her analysis sheet that she's got in front of her, because she doesn't necessarily know what all the analysis words mean. She's coloring and doodling on it. And she does, without even looking up, goes, I think that he's just sorry he got caught, because up until recently, his dialogue has all been about how he's the best and he deserves Maleficent's power and he is the one who should be able to take it, and she doesn't deserve it and she's just a villain. And she said, and now he went from those lines to immediately, I'm sorry. There was no point in remorse. Plus, look at his body language. And I'm like, this is a 5-year-old, and she has evaluated this entire thing and now knows the difference between genuinity in his feelings and like that remorse versus just busted feeling. And she could explain that to a room full of kids way older than her, who are just staring at her thinking, wow, she's really right. And then they were able to expand on that and get more out of it. But a 5-year-old looked at this book and read this text aloud with other people and suddenly understood that concept in a whole new way. And that's that power of the text, that it does have that literary thematic needs that we have. We're able to have that conversation, and we're able to bring it to all ages in that sense. We didn't lower the conversation down. We still had thematic conversations. We used words like antagonist and protagonist, and what does that mean, and what does it mean to be a villain. We had prediction conversations about what's going to happen next, and kids have to write or draw out those scenes as we keep going throughout the series. And it's like, these are the things that you're doing in high school courses and college courses, and these kids are able to do it at their age because they're interested enough in the subject that they want to be a part of that conversation. And so to say that the comic medium is, dumbing down the literature elements is such a disservice to a medium full of incredible art and literature. And I mean, we're not even talking about the art right now. We are going to talk about that, though. I'm going to be talking about that with an art historian tomorrow, which
Oh,
I'm
that's awesome.
excited. We're going to be discussing comics as an art medium and what we can take away from that. But it's just such a valuable tool to have. I know, Zach, your schedule is busy, so I don't want to keep you much longer. So if you had one big takeaway that you would want educators to think of when it comes to using comics, or parents to think of when using comics to teach their children? Like, what's the one thing you hope you can pass on to people?
I think the one thing I could hope to pass on to people is, it's a really great question. I think it's just talk to your kid about what interests them. I think it's so easy to kind of subscribe to what many of us subscribe, and it's no fault of anything, but it's just to like follow what the curriculum says, follow what the state, follow what the government, follow what the private school, follow what whoever the governing body of your child's education says, and just leave it at that. And I think in a lot of ways where parents can really sneak in a love of literacy is by finding moments to ask them when they go out, when they go to the store, when they are at the dinner table, what are you interested in reading? What are you interested in learning more about? What characters do you like that are out there? And then maybe even surprising your child, like letting them come home from school and find a gift on their bed, maybe a graphic novel about one of their favorite superheroes, maybe a story that they heard about from their local comic book shop that is related to another novel, or a novel that is similar to a graphic novel that's similar to one of their favorite books. Just talk to your kid about what they want and what they like, and then ask them questions. What did this story make them feel? What did this moment make them think about? These are all the things that I think in a lot of ways differentiate between those individuals who really take an active role in their child or their children or their classroom's learning, and someone who is, again, just going with the motions. And it's not to say that going with the motions is such a bad thing, but especially for those kids who may be struggling with reading, giving them a voice and actually valuing that voice, and then allowing that voice to come through in the decisions that are made with their literacy, with their reading decisions, or the things that they read. And again, that's not to say don't read the book assigned for class, but give them something that makes that book they're assigned for class feel more engaging, because they feel like they love to read. They love to read a graphic novel. They love to read a comic book. And because of that, it's an easier transition. So for me, ask your kid, ask your student, ask the kid you care for, what do you like to read? What characters do you like? What sorts of things can I get you for free reading time? And then engage them after that. Don't just leave it there, give them the book and say, sayonara, Sammy. Actually follow up. Say, what did you think about this moment? What is your favorite character? Why? Engage them with that, because when you give them a voice, they feel more empowered, more autonomous, and thus more excited for the next book and the book after that and the book after that.
Uh, and honestly, those are all the same things I would have said. So to go in a completely different direction, I want to say to all the educators who haven't used comics in their classroom, who are or put comics in their library, who are so struggling with where to start. There are resources everywhere. There are people who are happy to help. You can reach out to us at Bat City. We will do a library assessment for you. We will help you get books to put in that classroom. If you are an educator, we have free resources that are available on our website, and we're always happy to bring in more or do Zoom calls with you. I know Tim Smythe wrote a great book called Teaching with Comics that was an Eisner nominated book last year that has excellent plans on how to use comics in your classroom, and he goes into the details of how it's worked with his class and how it's worked with students. And there's so many things like that. I know the Will Eisner Week website actually has a list of resources on it as well. So if
Yeah.
it's something that you are wanting to try and you don't know where to start, find those resources. And if you're looking at those resources and you're like, I still don't know where to start, the best place to start is grab a bunch of comic books and put them on a table in your classroom and let the kids bring that in as that's going to be our reading today. Let that be the moment. Let them choose that as an option and see where they take that. See, have them, do something, a simple activity. One of the things we do a lot is read the comic book and then write that sentence synopsis that you would have to do if you were evaluating anything else, and make it a step further. Have them then pass that synopsis to the person next to them, and they have to draw a comic out of that synopsis and see how close it gets to that story. That's a super simple thing that you can to throw out there, and just get the conversation started. If you feel like I'm not an expert, I don't know what books to do, I don't know what books to bring in, like Zach said, talk to the kids in your care, talk to the kids you're working with. I promise you, there is at least one manga expert in your classroom. There is at least one Dave Pilkey expert in your classroom if you are working with anybody under the age of 33. There is somebody that knows that can lead you and be the guide. And if you give the kid the power to be that expert, you are going to turn that kid into somebody who absolutely not only adores reading but adores education at that point, because you've given them that empowerment and that ownership over that curation of that library, and you're going to see those kids get so excited to be a part of it. And again, the more the resources are out there, go to your local comic shop, ask them for like tips if you need it. If you don't know how to find a comic shop near you, there is a comicshoplocator.com where you can go in and type your address, and it will help you find the comic store closest to you. That's what they're there for. And if you can't find one near you, again, please reach out to us at Bat City. We are happy to always be your local comic shop, even if we're far away, and get you those resources and those books. And if you are looking to find some resources, it is Will Eisner Week, so I want to throw these out there. We've got there are books that Will Eisner that are based on Will Eisner's work that Will Eisner contributed to. This one is the Graphic Storytelling and Visual Narrative Guide, a great textbook for how to do all of those things and how to take some of the things that he did and apply them to it. And we also have comics and sequential art from the Will Eisner catalog, which is another great one that's just going to talk about what that medium is and how to use it. So again, these resources, a lot of them are available on the Will Eisner Foundation website, on the Will Eisner Week website. But if you're ever I don't know where to start, Will Eisner is a great place to start. He contributed so much to the industry, has done so many analysis, has done so many instruction guides. So if you're looking for where do I start, you can always start with Will Eisner. So thank you, Zach,
Thank
for
you, Shannon.
Zach and I will be doing this a lot more throughout the year. So feel free to keep an eye on that. If you want to hear more, we'll do some deep dives on a lot of these conversation points and stuff as well throughout the year. So keep following along for more information. But thank you so much, Zach, for today. And thank you to the Will Eisner Foundation and the people in charge of Will Eisner Week for celebrating his birthday by helping educators and parents and comic fans worldwide
And everyone.
have more incredible things to talk about. So thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.